So hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Jeff Siarto. I'm the User Experience Director at a company called Element 84. You may not have heard of Element 84, but you've certainly likely used some of the software we've written if you've dealt with any sort of geospatial-centric application. So we're a small 60-person software engineering firm just outside of Washington, D.C. And I've spent the better part of the last decade or so as I've been working at Element 84, sort of designing and building user interfaces on top of large-scale geospatial systems. So the topic I want to talk about today is sort of an idea and a thesis that I came up with about a month ago called "The Map is Not the Territory." And like all good ideas, mine started with a flippant tweet at the end of the day where I made a comment about how most geospatial apps start with a big map. And I kind of coined the Google Maps pattern. And I sort of wanted to question why we always start with this particular pattern and if it's really serving the best interests of our users. And so I asked the question, why do we start here? Why do we start with this user interface pattern? And really what I'm saying is, why do I start here? This is sort of an introspective question. Like, I find myself starting with this design pattern quite often when I'm sort of approaching new problems in the geospatial sphere. And I kind of wanted to know, why am I sort of pre-programmed this way, and what can I do to sort of break up this pre-programming to possibly think through alternative user interfaces that might benefit the user more so than this Google Maps pattern. So what is the Google Maps pattern, you ask? Well, that's a great question. So this is what I sort of coined as the Google Maps pattern, and it's really this 30-70 split in the screen where you have 30% of your sidebar is sort of results and metadata, I guess is what I'll call that. And then the other 70% is what I call a slippy map. So a slippy map, you can pan and zoom around it, you know, with your thumb or your cursor. And so this is like where the map interaction happens. And then you always have this little search bar at the top. And so this is the Google Maps pattern. We see this repeated over and over again in lots of different mapping applications, both done well and, in my opinion, done poorly. So there are really three heuristics that I've come up with that I think make the Google Maps pattern a really great option for a user interface. And that is nearby location. So if your application is very location specific and the application has context around where you are in space and time, then the Google Maps pattern is probably a good choice for a starting point. If your app needs to do wayfinding, so if you need to get from point A to point B, or you need to find things along that path, then I think the Google Maps pattern is also another great option. And then finally, if your application has really simple user flows, and so what I mean by this is if you're like a step or two away from the user being able to complete a task, then maybe this Google Maps pattern is the right direction that you want to take your user interface. So to sort of roll all this up, basically, if your input and output happen close to the map, then you're probably using the Google Maps pattern. And this works really well when you're doing these short jumps between input and map. So maybe I enter an address, and then that address information immediately shows up in the map, and then I'm looking back over to the sidebar to check and see if I have a restaurant nearby, or maybe if I misentered the address, or if I want to see something else about that location. I'm moving really quickly between all of these three spots. And I think this is where this pattern developed, because it works really, really well in this situation. So location specific, in situ, and short jumps between input and map. But what I deal with, a lot of geospatial apps, most of the flow focuses on that 30%. So the metadata, the information about the data sets is where we're mostly focused. And the map is sort of ancillary. But the problem is that I'll run into these interfaces that are showing 70% of the UI is taken up with oftentimes an unused map. And I think this can be very problematic when it comes to non-location specific geospatial interfaces. And so obviously, like, maps are fire, maps are the hotness. It's really great to develop maps. We have amazing tools like Mapbox and Leaflet, and you're able to make huge sort of like engineering strides in a very short amount of time. So you get that really pretty map up on the browser, and it's like, man, we're really making progress. But I'd argue that we need to maybe cool it off a little bit with the maps, and we need to sort of take a step back and not immediately gravitate toward that giant, cool, sexy, slippy map, and really take a step back and think about what it is we're trying to solve for our end user. And so I think it's important, particularly when we're dealing with a new user problem, that we really step back, we look at that workflow, we look at that core user problem, and make sure that the interface that we're going to end up with is actually solving that problem. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the Google Maps pattern, but it should be a conclusion we arrive at, and it shouldn't be the thing that we start with. And so those same three heuristics, I think you can apply to possibly looking at other patterns outside this Google Maps pattern. So again, if your application does not have sort of specific location information, so like if the application does not know about where I am in space and time, maybe you want to try something else. If you do not have wayfinding information, so if I don't need to know like how to get around on the map, or like if I'm not, walking out of my hotel room and in a new city and like doing that sort of like spin around in 360s with my phone in my hand to try to like make sure I'm walking the right way to the coffee shop. If you don't need that, then that giant map is probably not being well used. And then finally, if you have a complex user flow, so I sort of hedged it here at like 3+ interactions. So if your user flow and the steps to get through that interaction are greater than 3, I think you need to think about other alternative options for a map-based interface that might serve your users a little bit better. So I've got 3 sort of not anti-patterns, but like different patterns that are not the Google Maps pattern that I think you might want to consider. And this is not inclusive. This is just like the 3 that have been swirling around in my head for the last 4 weeks or so. So the first one is the Google Maps pattern as a secondary user interface element. So instead of starting your users off in that giant map and sort of like giving them the entire world to look at, maybe we preface that with some sort of search interface or a metadata browser or some other interface that narrows down their options or gives them some context for what's going to be displayed on the map. Maybe then that map just becomes the output display or the visualization. The second tool that I think you should consider are what I call Minimaps. And so these are sort of derived from the Minimaps in like first-person shooter games, where you have the little map at the bottom of your screen that sort of gives you context and situational awareness around your game, but it's not taking up the entire user interface. And so these Minimaps, when used in the context of like a geospatial app, they can give you some idea of where the data is that you're looking at is in space and time, but without sort of overwhelming. They're, again, a secondary user interface as opposed to a primary user interface. And the cool thing with the Minimaps is you can always expand them out. So you can sort of maximize the map when you need it and then minimize it when you don't. And so again, really great option for displaying sort of outputted visualizations, or sort of when the answer is on the map and you need to display that, as opposed to this constant back and forth interaction that you would see on the Google Maps pattern. And finally here, I've got what I like to call a Maplib, or sort of like a Mad Lib take on dealing with geospatial data. And again, instead of showing a giant map to a user and sort of asking them to create their bounding box and then sort of sort through a bunch of data sets to get to the answer that they're looking for, maybe we just do some sort of like usage-based discovery where we ask them, hey, what is the final metric you're looking for? Where is it in space and time? And so here, maybe if you clicked on that that little map button there, maybe you get a mini map. Maybe you can just drop in a like a GeoJSON file or a shape file that shows you where the location is on the map. And then you give it a temporal extent, and then you tell it what your output is, and then you just say go. And it goes and it finds all of the data over that particular area. It finds the location data, it makes sure there's no clouds on the data that's coming back to you, and then it maybe spits it out into a GeoTIFF or spits it out into a CSV. And then at that point, it can display it on a map, but you're not forcing this sort of heavy-handed map interaction right off the bat. Okay, so to recap, the Google Maps pattern is not a panacea. It's not the answer to every single user interface problem we sort of experience in the geospatial world, but it is great if you have location-dependent information, if you are doing wayfinding, and if you have a minimal amount of user interactions. If your app does not sort of fall into those heuristic categories, I think it's important to take a step back, revisit that user workflow, revisit that core user problem, and then develop the interface off of that. And so you might end up back at the Google Maps interface at the end of it, and that's cool, but at least you were sort of a bit more methodical about how you got there. And I encourage everyone to sort of give some of these other patterns a chance. And I think it will make for happier users in the long run. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you, and happy to take any questions, or you can send them to me on Twitter if you'd like. Thank you.